And so, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you, so many of you, on this beautiful evening. And my name is Edouard Kopp. I'm Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute. And it's a real pleasure to have this conversation tonight with Mel Bochner. The program is organized in conjunction with the unveiling this evening of Smudge. It is a work made with blue powder pigments, and we'll return to it later in the program. It is the fourth installment of our wall drawing series, which is now a key part of our program at the Drawing Institute, where we invite living artists to engage with the genre of the wall drawing, to think about what drawing can be on a large scale and in an ephemeral way. And it's amazing that each artist brings with them their own questions, their own answers, and invests the space in their own way. And it may be that this one, it may be the most visually restrained of them all, but conceptually the most powerful. Up for discussion. And we'd like to acknowledge Scott and Judy Nyquist, Elizabeth and Barry Young, UBS Private Wealth, Eddie Allen, and Chin-Wei Jun, and also Dylan Kyle and Sam Lasseter for their generous support for this wall drawing. We also want to thank the Kopp family for sponsoring this year's Artist Talk series. And as always, all our programs at the Menil are free and open to everyone. And we hope that you will look at upcoming programs on our website. I have to ask this, unless you have done so already, please silence your cell phones. So our conversation will be about 45-50 minutes, then we're open to questions for the floor. And then you're all invited to continue the conversation over a drink outside. And then about 10-15 minutes after the end of the Q&A, we'll also open our study room, which is this way, through the glass door, where we've pulled some works by Mel and some of his contemporaries and friends. And so we look forward to sharing some of our collection with you. So the program is recorded, and it will be made available online on the YouTube Menil channel. And I'd like to say a few words to introduce Mel. I'll be short.
Please.
So Mel Bochner is recognized as one of the leading figures in the development of conceptual art in New York in the 1960s and 70s. He emerged at a time when painting was increasingly discussed as outmoded, and he became part of a new generation of artists, which included also Eva Hesse, Judd, and Robert Smithson, artists who, like Bochner, were looking at ways of breaking with abstract expressionism and traditional compositional devices. His pioneering introduction of the use of language in the visual led Harvard University art historian Benjamin Buchloh to describe his 1966 show titled "Working Drawings and Other Visible Things on Paper Not Necessarily Meant to be Viewed as Art." And he qualified that exhibition as probably the first conceptual exhibition. So Mel came of age in the 1960s, a moment of radical change in both society at large as well as in art. And while painting slowly lost its preeminent position in modern art, language moved from talking about art to becoming part of the art itself. And the artist's work soon made a place for itself, as Mel put it, through the challenge of its own ideas. As he began exploring the use of words in fine art and in the intersection of verbal and visual representation. So Mel has consistently probed the conventions of painting, drawing, and language, and the way we construct and understand them, and how they relate to one another to make us more attentive to the unspoken codes that underpin our engagement with the world. Over 6 decades, he has kept challenging traditional definitions of drawing, notably by asking, what isn't a drawing? Which is a very generative and obviously thought-provocative question. And earlier this year, Mel had a major retrospective of his drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago. and I'm showing you a couple of installation views. And the show was accompanied by an excellent catalog in which he was very involved in conceiving, and beautiful reproductions of his work, also some of Mel's writings on drawing. As you may or may not know, Mel is a beautiful writer and a very, very precise one. And I have to say that the catalog also includes a wonderful essay by Anna Lovat, that is really illuminating Mel's practice. And Anna was last year's research fellow at the Menil Drawing Institute, so a nice coincidence. And in case you're interested, there are a few signed copies at the Menil bookstore for purchase. Mel, it's great to have you.
Thank you.
And you're a busy man, so I'm really grateful that you came. You were supposed to come a bit earlier, but there was something called the pandemic that kind of wrecked our plans a little bit.
Got in a way, right.
But, and what Mel and I thought we would do to give a kind of context to Smudge would be to start by looking at some of his earliest drawings as a way to introduce some of the key themes of his practice. Then we'll look more closely at his first engagement with wall drawing, and then we'll look at examples past Smudge. And you'll see that there's a real evolution, and yet with Mel, his practice never evolves in a straight line. There's often a creative return to earlier questions and problems. And so, for starters, Mel, I just wanted to ask a simple question. When did you start making drawing or thinking about drawing in earnest? And also, what kind of training did you get at Carnegie Institute of Technology?
Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh, which had a... Can you hear me? I don't know. I grew up in Pittsburgh, which had a very enlightened art education program. So starting at about age 7 or 8, each school would send... Thank you. Each school would send a student to these classes that were held at the museum. They were very large. There were hundreds of kids there. And you would come in, they would give you a piece of masonite, a piece of paper, a couple of crayons. You'd sit down in, this beautiful Rococo auditorium. And the teacher would give a lesson, something, and you were supposed to take notes. Like one lesson would be something like the colors of autumn. And then you would turn over your paper, and you'd had like half an hour, I can't remember, 45 minutes, to make a drawing of your own about the colors of autumn. And there was this very, I can't say strange, but looking back, surprising competitive aspect to it, which was, all these hundreds of drawings. The teacher would have to go through them during the week and sort them into 3 piles. First pile would be good, and then very good, and then better than very good. And that would be the smallest pile. And then from the group of better than very good drawings, she would choose 8 to invite those people up onto the stage in front of all these hundreds of kids to reproduce their drawing on a big sheet of brown paper that was mounted on an easel in colored chalk. And this was a really big deal for, a 9 or 10-year-old. Now, the thing was that it would all be decided on a Thursday, and then they would call your mother to tell her, your son or daughter is on the very best list and we're inviting them up. So one would run home Thursday afternoon, and it would be, "Mom, did you get a call?" "No." "You must have gotten a call. I know my drawing was the best." "No, I didn't get a call." "Did you go out shopping today?" "Yeah." "You're not supposed to go shopping on Thursday. You missed the call." So anyway, it was very enlightening to meet these hundreds of kids from other schools that you otherwise, would never meet or see. And then to get chosen to go up on stage and say, "My name is Mel Bochner. I go to Linden Elementary School, and these are my colors of autumn." It was a very heady experience. From there, you graduated. When you went to high school, they chose a smaller group to take a painting class, a watercolor class. When you became a senior in high school, an even smaller group was chosen to go up to the art school and have real drawing lessons, with a real drawing teacher. And so, people say, "Oh, why did you become an artist?" I don't know. It seemed destined. They picked me. I didn't pick them. And then, I went to Carnegie, was then called Carnegie Institute of Technology. And it was a very interesting time because this is like 1957, 58. There were two competing schools or theories of art education. The one was the very classical, you put a model on the stand, you have a piece of paper, you have a piece of charcoal, you have an eraser, and you draw the model. The other was the Bauhaus model, where you did all the Albers, the cutting out little squares and colors, gluing them down. So these two things were competing at the school. So in the morning, you draw from the model. In the afternoon, you cut out little black squares. And it was a really very well-rounded education because you got both. You got both, and you wanted to find out what you could do with both. That's how it started.
So you graduated in 1962, moved to New York in 1964, and working in the abstract expressionist vein. Is that correct?
Well, I was a wannabe abstract expressionist when I was in school. I mean, that was the cool thing to do. I mean, who didn't want to be de Kooning? I mean, everybody wanted to be de Kooning. But when you got out of school, you had to come to the conclusion that you weren't de Kooning, and you didn't have a chance, actually. So yeah, I moved out to California, to San Francisco, which was supposed to be where things were happening. After a 96-hour bus ride from Pittsburgh. And what I found was that art school doesn't train you to do anything. If you apply for a job, "Oh, did you go to college?" "Yes." "What did you study?" "Painting." "Oh, thank you very much. We don't need any painters." So, I got all kinds of odd jobs, and I worked for a while as in a restorer's company, restoring antiques, making frames, trying to paint at night and finding it was impossible, and going through a whole period of more or less questioning everything I thought I knew, sort of realizing I didn't really know anything.
And yet, come 1966, and you start to make very, very generative drawings, right, for you?
Yeah. It's very hard to really recreate the context. I mean, I wanted to be in New York. I was desperate to be in New York. There's a famous illustration that Andy Warhol did for a short story in some magazine called "Success is a Job in New York." I thought an apartment was success in New York, if you could find an apartment. And the art world was not much smaller than it is today. It was minuscule compared to today. You could see every show you wanted Saturday afternoon. There were only like 6 galleries that were interesting. There were no collectors, really. And somehow I started out, the first job I had was working as a guard at the Jewish Museum, which was the in place at the time. It's where Rauschenberg had a retrospective, Jasper had a retrospective, the New American Sculpture, the New American Painting. You know, it was like a very exciting place. And I realized that, you know, my pseudo-abstract expressionist paintings were not what I really wanted to be doing, but then what did I want to be doing? How do you find yourself in that context? And I lucked into a job writing art reviews for Arts Magazine. And I got an interview with the editor, and he said, "Have you done a lot of writing?" I said, "No." "Well, have you written any reviews?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, what makes you think you can do this?" I said, "Well, I read them and they don't look that hard to do." So he said, "Okay, I'll give you a tryout." He handed me a sheet with 30 exhibitions on it. And he said, "This is your tryout. Review these shows, send them to me, and I'll let you know." Well, that's fair. Now, the thing was, you got $2.50 for each review that you wrote, whether they published it or not. So if you reviewed all 30, what did you make, like $65 or $70? And my rent was only $21. So, like, this was great. This was heaven. So I sent in those first reviews. I didn't hear from them. And then I bought a copy of the magazine, and there they were. They printed the first ones. And suddenly I was an art writer.
And published author.
And published author, yes. I won't bore you with all the details, but that led to a job teaching at the School of Visual Arts, teaching art history, which I'd never studied. But I bought some books, and I stayed a week ahead of the class.
So Mel, I wanted to start with this drawing called Child's Play, and it's on the screen with a related sculpture. And it's a good example of your early interest in mathematics, permutations, and just a general idea of play. And I was wondering whether you could just talk us through briefly through the drawing and explain its relationship to the sculpture.
Well, in an attempt to move away from abstract expressionism and, emotionalism and personality and all of that, the thought was going around to try to find some more objective way of working, of making something that expressed your ideas rather than just expressing your emotions, feelings. And so I had this set of blocks made, like little kitty blocks. And, a lot of artists were making sculptures at that point. Judd and LeWitt, Morris, whose work I all really liked a lot. But I had this little one-room apartment, and I couldn't make big sculptures. I couldn't get them in the door. So I decided to go in the opposite direction. And I had these blocks made, and I would make arrangements of these blocks. At first, I did think, well, I can make these big. They'd be really interesting. And then I thought, I don't have to make them big. It's really just the idea that counts to me and how to arrange them. So you see the drawing at the top of the Child's Play drawing is a cube, 3 by 3 by 3, right? Then next, which would be the 6th, is 3 by 3 by 2 high. Then you go to the next one, and it's 2 by 2 by 2 deep, and then it's 3 by 2. I can't remember. Anyway, it was just a question of putting the blocks together in these numerical patterns. And while I was doing this, it just struck me, this is like a kid playing with blocks. And that seemed really interesting to me because there was nothing else around it. It was sort of pure. No aesthetic considerations, no professional considerations, no artistic. And so I just wrote at the top of the drawing, Child's Play, And it was fun. It was fun.
And then in the same year, 1966, you start to make these incredible portraits in words. And this is a portrait of your friend, Sol LeWitt. And I wonder if you could talk us through the drawing a little bit.
Well, I've told you the story of when I was a kid and I did a lot of drawing, and I was very good at doing portraits. I love to do portraits of people. When I was in the Army, I did these things called sweetheart portraits. The other guys in the platoon would bring me a photo of their girlfriend or their mom or something, and I would do a pencil drawing of them for $1, and they could get that framed and sent to their mother or their girlfriend. I wanted to continue to do portraits, but the way I was working, like with the wooden cubes, how do you do a portrait? So it occurred to me that, a drawing is a representation, right? And you can represent things with words. So words are representative too. So I did this series of 4 drawings of close friends of mine. And I wanted to represent them with these words. And where do you find words? You find them in the thesaurus. So I would copy these words out of the thesaurus. And they would have to do with their work as well. Lewitt did squares, and he was interested in all kinds of mathematical progressions and permutations. But he always wanted, how can I put this? He was only interested in closed systems. And so I thought closure was an interesting word to look up for him. And then I copied all of these words out of the thesaurus, and that was my portrait of Saul Lewitt.
And here, installation view of your groundbreaking show, working drawings and other visible things on paper. And I mean, for me, it's so radical because you seem to be questioning the role of the object, the role of the original, but also the role of the artist. And so
Well, these things always come out of a context or a situation. Oops. So there I was teaching art history at the School of Visual Arts. And the director of the gallery didn't have an exhibition for the month of December. So, I was like the youngest teacher there. And she thought, oh, well, you probably know a lot of young artists. Would you like to organize a Christmas show for the gallery? I said, yeah, that would be fun. So I thought, what do I want to do? What could be different? And I was very interested, as you can see in that drawing you saw, in what I call the upstream. What happens before the work of art? What happens upstream, the thinking that goes on? And how do you represent that in what I was calling working drawings? Not a sketch of a sculpture or a painting, but maybe just somebody writing down some notes, or the size of the lumber they have to order to make the stretcher or whatever. So I went to a number of people I knew and a lot of people I didn't know, and I asked them for 5 drawings that fulfill this definition. I got all the drawings. Some of them were just like little scraps of paper like that. I took them to the gallery director and I showed her, and she looked at me and she said, what the hell are these? And I explained the working drawings. And she said, what do you want me to do with them? I said, just simple frames. I'm not paying for frames for these raggedy things. Oh. So then I had a kind of dilemma, because I couldn't go back to all of these people who I respected and were friends and say, well, sorry, the show's been called off, So since I was teaching in the art history department, I had access to this brand new fangled invention called the Xerox machine. And I thought, since the drawings were virtually devoid of personality, I mean, you couldn't tell the difference between, an Eva Hesse sketch and a Saul Lewitt or Donald Judd. They were just raggedy things, really. So I went up to the Xerox room and I Xeroxed all these drawings. Now, they might have gone in like little shapes or funny things, but they all came out the same size. They all came out 8.5 by 11, and they came out in a stack. And so my first thought had been, well, I'll take these and I'll pin them up on the wall. But when I said, that's a dumb idea. They're a book. It's already a book. So I went to a stationery store and bought 3-ring binder book, and I put each drawing in, one sleeve. And which ones are these? Oh, Anonymous and John Cage. I didn't have enough. I mean, I thought I had to have at least 100, or else it would look like too little. So I got magazines like Scientific American and all kinds of things, and just Xeroxed them until I had 100. And then I thought, I don't want this to be a precious object. So I decided I'd make more than one. And I thought, well, the first number that is not a prime number is 4, which suggests that, it can go on forever. And so I made 4. And I had these pedestals made that looked sort of like a Robert Morris sculpture. And I put the books on the pedestal, and that was the exhibition. Suddenly, the director of the gallery got more interested. So she said, well, I'm going to call Xerox Corporation and tell them we have this artwork made out of Xerox, and they'll get us some publicity. So she calls them, and they said, oh, yeah. Oh, we haven't had any artworks made out of Xerox, and we're going to send a writer down. So they sent a writer and a photographer down. The writer looked through the book, and he said, somebody said there was an artwork here, but this is just a book of Xeroxes. I said, yeah, the book of Xeroxes is the artwork. He said, a book of Xeroxes can't be an artwork. Yeah, there's nothing for me here, sorry. But he did bring along a photographer. And you can kind of see the grumpy look on my face, because I was annoyed with this guy. But the photographer was there, and he said, let's take a picture anyway. So that's why this is basically the only photograph of that exhibition. It met with critical silence. Because I think most people agreed it was just a book of Xeroxes. But it seemed to have had some effect, because within 6 months, there were exhibitions of books and Xeroxes.
Still 1966, you develop another sort of groundbreaking interest in your practice, an interest in space. You also start using graph paper, and one art historian has called you a connoisseur of graph paper. And I wanted to ask you, what do you like about graph paper, and how did you come to that composition?
Well, with graph paper, you don't have to make anything up. I mean, I don't have to draw a perspective of the room. They drew it for me. So I started thinking of how to work in space and maybe get rid of the blocks altogether. So this is, I call it a floor labyrinth. That was really, I guess, the first in situ drawing or plan for a drawing I did. That would have been like masking tape. So you'd come into an empty gallery and you'd find your way through this labyrinth and then back out. So it would be the experience of you finding yourself in this space in all different ways and facing different ways and twisting and turning and maybe getting lost, which seemed to me like an interesting metaphor for the experience of being an artist.
So in 2009, you published a really interesting text titled "Why Would Anyone Draw on a Wall?"
And why would anyone want to draw?
Want to draw on the wall, and the text is really interesting because you describe but also analyze three powerful visual experiences you had at the time. One of which was a show at the Metropolitan, and this slide shows the cover of the catalog of that show, and then some illustrations. And if you could tell us what struck you about these fresco works.
It was right after, a couple years after the big flood in Florence. And they had initiated this project of taking the frescoes off the wall. And they had a way of doing it. They would, I think it was like a big piece of canvas with glue, and they would glue it to the front. And then, since the fresco is painted on just a very thin layer of plaster, they would kind of like roll the plaster off the wall, and then they would mount it on a wooden panel or something. So a whole group of those were sent to the Met, this show, The Great Age of Fresco. And, myself and most of my contemporaries had never been to Italy at that point and never seen anything like this. And we thought that, Barnett Newman and Clifford Still and Rothko, they made Pollock, that was the biggest paintings you could make. But then you saw these and they were like gigantic because they were the whole wall of a church. But the thing that got me was, you see, on the left is the fresco. Who's it by? Pietro de Cristoforo, blah, blah, blah. But when they peeled off the painted layer, they came to the last layer, which was the drawing, which is called a synopia. And what's so fascinating is not only comparing how the artist changed the drawing subtly in this case, but sometimes dramatically in the final painting, but the final painting is very closed. You know what I mean? It's tight, it's closed, it's precise. Whereas the drawing is just very fresh. So you just can imagine this guy coming into the church and like putting this big drawing on the wall. And I thought, there's something there I can use. There's something really special about that.
And then you talk about two other strong experiences in 1968.
Well, 1968 was a very historic year because it was the year in France of the student revolution, the 68ers, where the students at the University of Nanterre walked out of class, and they were joined in these huge demonstrations by Marxists, Leninists, situationists, whatever, and large parts of the liberal public. And they almost took over Paris. They did. They forced de Gaulle to go into hiding. He had to escape to Germany and go into hiding until they really called out the army and, we're not putting up with this any longer. But one of the things that the students did, which I was fascinated by, the press photos that were coming back, is they were writing graffiti on the wall. And it was like this huge public conversation. And it was very poetic because this translated means, beneath the paving stones, the beach. That's a really sweet thought. Beneath the paving stones, the beach. So that civilization is only a layer. And I thought, I'd like to get that kind of directness into my work. I mean, it couldn't be slogans, but somehow I knew that meant something. And the other thing, which was quite marvelous, was this Andy Warhol cow wallpaper room. So Castelli Gallery was like the Mecca of that time. That's where the best artists were. The Andy Warhol show was a big deal. So you come up the steps, go in the first room, and the rooms were small. And he had done these silver balloons that were just floating around the space. So basically, nothing for sale. He had just stopped painting completely, and he was just doing these balloons. And I thought, it's interesting. But then in the back room, you walked in, and here were all these cows plastered to the wall. And it was like, what? You know, it's that thing that you ask yourself, like, can you really get away with that? Just putting cows on the wall? Yeah, you can. But the remarkable thing to me was, you know, there was this whole discourse in the 60s and the 50s about painting being flatness. Painting is flat. You had to accept that a painting was flat. Here, the wallpaper is flat. It's literally flat. It's literally decorative. It's not like you put a mark on a canvas and say, oh, that's flat. No, this is different. And it went around the room. So this was a painting that completely surrounded you. And wherever you, as the viewer, were, there was always more painting behind you. So you're the center of your experience. I thought that was pretty radical. I really did.
So that provides a really good context for your first smudge. So can you tell us what happened in the studio one day?
Well, you know, these things run around in your mind. You can't really predict what you're going to do or know what you're going to do, but I knew I wanted to make some kind of a mark on the wall. And I wanted it to be like a direct experience. Because you make a painting on canvas, you bring it, you hang it on the wall. The viewer's experiencing an event which happened somewhere else, right? Something done on the wall is right there for you. It's a direct experience. It closed. I mean, one of the hardest things to do with a work or any work is to close the space between the viewer and the artwork. Because there's so much noise. There's so much just noise. And it's hard to get rid of. By putting these marks directly on the wall, I thought I could cut down on the noise because it was such an unexpected experience. Like, why would anybody just put a smudge on the wall? But why not? And I had some blue carpenter's chalk around. You know, when you have like a line and you want to snap line and you coat the string with blue chalk. So I just dipped my hand in the chalk, and I thought this was like a very primeval gesture, you know, just like that. That's what you get.
So I'm curious, so each of these works is unique in the sense that it's site-specific. So first, where does the work stop? Where does it end?
Damn good question. I don't know. I usually measure the wall that it's on. So I don't know, this is like, say, a 25-foot wall by 12 feet. So you look at the smudge, oh, what's the size of this work? 12 by 25 feet.
And you were, as you were working, you were talking about the texture of this wall, and you were comparing it to paper, right?
Yeah, this wall is absolutely beautiful, the surface of it. And when you work this way, you have to take what the wall gives you. You can't change the texture of the wall. You can't change the spots on the wall. I mean, you have to accept the background, so to speak. And this wall was just delightful. Whoever the painter is, I take my hat off to him.
We'll pass on your regards.
Okay.
And then from smudge,
I went big.
You went big, and you covered more wall with more powdered pigment. And here is an early work you did at SF MoMA.
Yeah, that's at SF MoMA.
So I mean, it's amazing because it really edges towards the end of the wall. And so, what's the impact? What's the effect that you're trying to?
I didn't want to go to the absolute edge of the wall. I mean, the idea of expanding the smudge. The title is Expanse. But I didn't want it to just be a blue painted wall. So I sort of crept up to the edges of the wall. And so it kind of floats. This is probably the closest I've gotten to Monet.
What about this one? Downgrade.
This one's called Downgrade, so it starts with an absolute hard edge on 3 sides, and then I just take the chalk and slowly bring it down until it fades out, down. So it's like a downgrade.
And you also included geometry in some of them.
Yeah.
Or left out geometry, because it's...
Well, that's true, yeah. Or tried to repurpose geometry. So my father was a sign painter, and we used to have to make patterns for the signs. And it's an age-old technique. Michelangelo used it. You know what a pounce wheel is? When you're making clothes, you run a pounce wheel along. And so I took some paper and I made a grid with a pounce wheel. And then I laid it down on the paper and I sprayed it with spray paint so that the paint came through the little holes.
And so that led to something like this?
Yeah, that led to this. And since I couldn't get pounce wheels big enough to make it that size, because that's pretty big, I used masking tape. I just taped the grid, and then I rubbed the pigment on, and then I pulled the tape off. So it's like a stencil idea, basically.
Here's another example.
Yeah, this was a very wonderful collector of mine who passed away last year, Suzanne Cohen. And she commissioned me to do one of these pieces in her house. And then when she died, she left it to the Baltimore Museum. And my first idea was just to do this thing, random lines, of masking tape rubbed with blue chalk. But then I wanted to ground it in her experience. So this is the shape of the wall that I did it on in her house. So the door, you can tell, obviously, ceiling, walls. So it's like a ghost of her house in the gallery. And everybody says, well, what's that funny shape? Oh, that's Sue Cohen's wall.
And then you started making measurement works. And I was curious to know how you got the idea. And that becomes a kind of...
How much time do we not have?
A few more minutes.
All right, well, one way into this, there's a lot of ways into it, is it has a relationship to that Warhol idea. Because the whole room is measured, so it's always behind you. You're the center of the room. And I was interested in finding a way to try, instead of like the smudges, which are very romantic, really, I wanted something that was more objectified. And measurement is objectivity. So this was actually done in Munich at Gallery Heiner Friedrich. The show directly before was Walter de Maria's Earth Room. So it was a very kind of radical moment. Because nobody could think that these things were saleable. And the funniest thing that happened, now that I think of it, was on the day that it opened, the gallery got a call from a newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine, I think it was called, which is the biggest newspaper, most important newspaper in Germany. And they were sending a critic to review the show, which they'd never had a review in this newspaper. Oh, they were so excited. So the critic comes over. He walks in, a man in a big overcoat, and he says, I can't review this show. Really? Why? He said, you're using inches. I only measure things in meters. I said, oh. He said, how dare you come to Germany and do a measurement in inches? I said, well, my work is about my direct experience. And since I don't measure in meters and centimeters, I'd have to have somebody do it and translate it for me, and then I'd have to accept it. And I can't accept it. He said, well, I can't review it. So he walked out, and the gallery was very displeased, and very displeased with me. And they said, oh, that guy is so stupid. How could he be so stupid? I said, no, he's not very stupid at all. I said, I think that's a very legitimate response. Because the thing about a measurement is you're called upon to believe it. Is that really 8 feet 9 inches? Well, everybody doesn't walk around with a tape measure in their pocket. So, is it true? Is it false? Is the artist telling the truth? Is this... So, I think without his probably being able to articulate it, he got the real nub of the question. He wasn't capable of knowing whether it was true or false. So I didn't think he was stupid. I would have liked a review, however. Didn't get it.
So with the time that we don't have, we're going to move to some other example. This one. And it seems to me that it's an important moment for you because your love of language and your interest in wall drawing merge.
There was an annual show at Dwan Gallery called the Language Show. I think it started like in 68 and went to 71, I don't remember. And it was a moment when conceptual art was becoming dominant in a way. And a lot of people were engaged with using language. And there was this notion, implicit notion, that painting something, you couldn't express yourself. But just saying something or writing something was like a direct line to a person's brain. But of course we know that's not true. I mean, we know that from George Orwell from a long time ago, that language hides all kinds of meanings and agendas and falsehoods. So I came up with this idea of like painting a blackboard on the wall, but leaving the bottom of it rough, because my idea was that language is never complete. Language is always leaking. Language is always changing. And then, as if I was the first grade teacher, I very crudely wrote, language is not transparent. And that was my farewell to conceptual art. Oh, this was a really interesting installation, which was at the Pompidou Center. And they did this wall painting of mine, Forgetting is the Only Continuum, which, when you reach a certain age, you begin to understand. And then on the other wall, the rest of the room was empty, they had Rauschenberg's Erased de Kooning. Isn't that a beautiful, at least to me, that was a beautiful combination. Because he erased the de Kooning as a positive gesture, not as a negative gesture. I think that's really profound. This is like falling off a building and watching your life flash before you.
And you land in Houston, Texas in 1980.
Yeah. This was at the Texas Gallery, right? And this was the biggest wall painting I ever did. I think it was like 17 feet high. There's so much background to this, I can't begin to explain it, but part of my farewell to conceptual art is I wanted to find new ways to make my work visual. And that meant, for me as a painter, color. And somebody said to me around this point, well, are you renouncing all your early work? I said, no, I don't renounce anything. I expand my early work. these were also fugitive and they get painted over. Which when I was that age, I thought, well, that's really interesting. Now I think, what was I doing?
And Mel, how did you come up with these very elaborate compositions?
Well, each one of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shapes is composed of 3 shapes: a triangle, a square, and a pentagon. So you see like the orange shape, you can see the triangle at the top, right? And then if you come down along the yellow edge, the edge next to the brown, and across and back up to the triangle, that's a pentagon. And next to that is a square. So there are a number of different ways, and this sort of goes back to the blocks of combining these 3 shapes. And I don't want to get too esoteric here. Most geometric art is either rigidly geometric or slightly organic. And I wanted to find a way, like putting these shapes together, they're very unpredictable. Like if you look at the brown, the one that has the brown ground, the second from the right, that's the same exact shape as the one that has the blue ground. The pentagon, the triangle, and the square. So you can put them together in different ways, and they're unpredictable, and they're organic, but they're still geometric. I'm sort of running out of words.
So let's end with this one, which is very rich work.
This is called Language is Transparent, going back to that format from 1969. And it's the words, language is not transparent, translated into 15 different languages, and then written one on top of the other. I had a friend who was an ambassador to the United Nations, and I asked her to go around and ask people for translation, into their language of those words. And to me, it's the contemporary Tower of Babel. Okay. Have I earned my supper yet?
Yes. Are you ready for some questions?
Yeah, I want to hear somebody else talk.
So there's a microphone with my colleague Tony, so just raise your hand and the microphone will come to you.
Oh, come on.
Thank you. Hi, Mel. Thank you for talking us through so many fascinating works. And something that just came to my mind listening to you was how many of these materials you were using in the 60s were preparatory materials that weren't intended to be seen. So the blue carpenter's chalk, the line would have been preparatory, the masking tape, and even the working drawings were not necessarily intended to be displayed to the public. So I wonder if you could reflect on what attracted you to those sort of preparatory materials and objects that wouldn't normally have made their way into the public realm.
Well, I think it was just the way to break with business as usual. To find other ways to express oneself, and also to keep me from getting bored. I mean, to do something that surprised me. A material will give you a surprise. Some things you can control and some things you can't control. So I didn't want to use things where you had to go to the art supply store and order them in a package, I just wanted to use things that were kind of around my studio: wrapping paper, masking tape, blue powder pigment, string, things like that. And then do something with it, try to make it interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you for what I would call a very non-transparent presentation. My question is, do you pretty much have your end product in mind when you start something like any of these projects? Or is it kind of organic? You kind of grow it as you do it?
I think it's a little bit of both. Jasper Johns once said, sometimes I see it and then I do it. Sometimes I do it and then I see it. So I think that's very true of studio experience, if you have studio experience. And I guess over the last 50 years that I've been working, studio experience has become less important to artists. I was never one that took a drawing to a metal fabricator and said, make this for me, okay? Or whatever. But both of those things are legitimate to me, and I don't have a preference. It happens when it happens. This one actually came to me in Belgium, because the thing about Belgium is there are 2 languages in that country. And the people who speak Walloon don't speak to the French. The people who speak French don't speak to the Walloons. And every sign is in these 2 languages. And the whole world there is Magritte. That's Magritte. And I thought, instead of having the 2 languages, one above the other, side by side or whatever, what if you put one on top of the other? What would you get? And eventually, this is what I got. So it wasn't preconceived as such. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I don't know that there's a definitive answer.
Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. At one point you referred to sort of the noise, perhaps, between the experience of somebody encountering the work and the work itself. And I'm just curious, have you, when it comes to institutional architecture, have you met a moment where you're installing something or conceiving of one of these wall drawings or works where the work is defined by the measurements of the space of the gallery itself within, say, a museum? It's something that you've encountered that was like, this isn't going to work, basically, and I say that just because we're surrounded right now in Houston in these very grandiose museum architectures, and I just wonder if that's something that, in the span of your career, you've encountered.
Well, it relates a little bit to that question that the previous gentleman asked. Sometimes I just walk into a space and I look at it and I'm like, what the hell am I going to do here? And then it's sink or swim.
Yep.
You try to come up with something. I had a show at GIA a couple years ago, which is a space about 3 times as big as this. A very industrial, kind of space, beautiful space. And when I walked in, I was like, oh my God, what could you possibly do here? It's like so alienating in a way. It's so big. It's like, what could you do? And then the first thing that came to me was nothing. Yes, but there's various types of nothing. So what I did was I measured the circumference of the space. I wrapped it in a red line. So you came in, you didn't really see this space. You saw this slice, this red slice that cut through, bigger than a soccer field. So I did nothing, basically.
Thank you.
In other words,
I also saw that show.
I don't try to do something to transform the experience. I try to accept the experience.
Hi, Mel.
Hi.
So in the 60s, language as an art form started to happen. You were talking about critics maybe not getting a sense or not feeling that they could write. But I'm wondering, what was the audience's reaction to a lot of the changes that you were making? And obviously you were receptive to the galleries to a certain extent after '66, but how would you talk about that experience?
There wasn't a lot of interest in my work, quite frankly. Galleries are in business to sell stuff. And, oh yeah, there's the red line. There's not much to sell there. So, and there's a language to criticism that's accepted. How you write about a work of art. In the 60s, it was like flatness and color field and shapes and things like that. A guy came to interview me a few years ago, and he said, well, how did it feel to be part of the dominant discourse of the 60s? I said, are you kidding? The dominant discourse of the 60s was Frank Stella and Kenneth Nolan and Clement Greenberg. The people I knew, didn't have that much attention. But of course, what's fascinating to me is that, and very heartwarming, I need to say, that something I did 50-some years ago could still interest people. There's no predicting that. You see what I'm saying? There's no predicting that. And over time, critical language evolves. And then there becomes maybe a language for it. But there's lots of things there's still no language for. I don't think there's a real language for Eva Hesse's work, for example. I mean, she's a genius and her work is fantastic, but most of what's written, who cares? We have a gentleman in the 10th row. Thank you.
What book have you returned to the most throughout your life?
Probably Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Yeah. For sure.
And the phrase "language is not transparent" comes from him, right?
No.
It doesn't?
No. It comes from me.
Time for one last question.
Yeah, I guess, following up on that question, sometimes like when you're alone and you're thinking about your work, and you ask yourself, who would I really like to see my work and hear what they think? For me, it comes down to two. One would be Wittgenstein, and the other would be Matisse. Then I would like to do something that I could show to Matisse, and he would say, not bad, not bad. Then I could die happy. Is that it? Does everybody want a drink? I do.
Yeah, let's go for a drink. Thank you, Mel.